Scary telling.
The small town was always bustling with activity around Halloween, and the protagonist couldn't help but love it. The whole community seemed to come together to celebrate, with every civic organization and business hosting their own little carnivals and festivals. But the Scarecrow competition at Hidden Spring Cave Park was always the highlight of the season for the protagonist. The competition was open to all the schools in the district, as well as a few businesses, and each entry was placed along the walking trails of the park for the community to admire and vote on. The winner with the most votes by Halloween would receive a $100 prize, while the grand prize winner, chosen by a panel of judges, would receive $500 and a picture on the front page of the local paper. As the protagonists strolled along the paths of the park, they marveled at the creativity and hard work that had gone into each scarecrow. Most were your run-of-the-mill scarecrows, with straw hats, plaid shirts, and work gloves. But a few entries stood out, like the one created by the local dermatologist, Dr. Sterling. Dr. Sterling was a well-respected member of the community, but had become reclusive since his wife left him earlier in the year. The protagonist was happy to see him getting out and about again, but was taken aback by his scarecrow entry. It was too well made, too realistic, with a rough burlap skin that clung to the frame beneath to form an almost perfect face. Sharp cheekbones sat beneath the black button eyes, and the outstretched arms and legs stretched into a T that made the protagonist feel as though they were looking at a crucifixion. The clothes were also a bit strange, with a blue silk blouse and a pair of white clam digger pants stretched over the anatomical frame. Both were in excellent condition and seemed too nice to use for a project like this. As the protagonist walked away, the scarecrows seemed to watch them, haunting their mind for the rest of the day. They loved the scarecrows on the trail, but Dr. Sterling's entry was too realistic for comfort. Over the next few days, the protagonist became increasingly uncomfortable with the scarecrow, which seemed to grow more disturbing with each passing day. And the birds were becoming more and more ominous. Crows and ravens circled above the woods, sometimes swooping so closely that the protagonist could feel the wind rustling through their hair. As Halloween drew closer, the flock of birds grew thicker and more aggressive. The protagonist could hear their hateful cries from far away, and the sight of Dr. Sterling's scarecrow covered in the black birds only added to their unease. Despite their growing discomfort, the protagonist couldn't help but be drawn back to the park every day to check for new entries in the competition. But they couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about Dr. Sterling's scarecrow, something that made them increasingly nervous to be near it. The protagonist wondered if anyone else felt the same way, or if they were the only one who saw the disturbing qualities in the scarecrow. They would soon find out that they weren't alone. The protagonist's unease continued to grow as Halloween approached. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with Dr. Sterling's scarecrow, and the flock of birds only added to their discomfort. The blackbirds circled above the woods and lined the entrance to the walking trails, their cries filling the air and piercing the usual serene atmosphere of the park. The protagonist could feel their heart pounding and the fear of being lost in the woods like a small child. The further they walked into the trail, the thicker the flock of birds grew. If they couldn't see them, they could hear their hateful racket. It was as if they were waiting to strike, and the protagonist couldn't help but feel like they were being watched. The protagonist approached Dr. Sterling's scarecrow with trepidation, their unease growing as they drew closer. The scarecrow was covered in the black birds, and they seemed to be pecking at it madly. The protagonist wondered what could be attracting the birds to the scarecrow and why they seemed so intent on destroying it. As they drew closer to the scarecrow, the birds grew more agitated. They flapped their wings and took flight, darting above the protagonist's head. A few swooped so closely that the protagonist could feel the wind rustling through their hair. The chorus of evil things would cry out from the trees until they moved away. And then there was the stench. The fetid smell of decomposition hung in the air, making the protagonist gag. It was the smell of death, and it was coming from Dr. Sterling's Scarecrow. The protagonist wondered what could be causing such a foul odor. Had the birds killed something nearby? They had always thought crows and ravens were carrion birds, but maybe they were hunters. They couldn't be sure. The cluster of black birds must have killed something nearby. The protagonist couldn't help but wonder if it was something that had been intentionally placed there to attract them. The trail walkers were at an all-time low that year, and the protagonist couldn't help but feel like the Scarecrow and the birds were to blame. They wondered if something needed to be done, but they didn't know who to talk to or what to say. As they left the park that day, the protagonist couldn't help but feel like something was watching them from behind. They quickened their pace and didn't look back until they reached their car. The park was silent, but the feeling of unease lingered. The protagonist couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over them since they had first seen Dr. Sterling's Scarecrow. They knew that something was wrong, but they didn't know what to do about it. As the competition drew to a close, the protagonist became increasingly concerned about the disturbing Scarecrow and the birds that seemed to be drawn to it. They knew that they had to voice their concerns to someone, but they didn't know who to turn to. Finally, they decided to call a few of the other judges on the panel to share their concerns. Most of them were equally disturbed by Dr. Sterling's creation, but they didn't think that was a reason not to consider it for the grand prize. Before the protagonist could even recommend its removal, they stated their intentions to vote it the grand prize winner. Feeling frustrated and powerless, the protagonist decided to try calling Dr. Sterling himself. They called his office several times, but only the automated voicemail system picked up. They left a few messages and even called the emergency number, but they never received a call back from him. As Halloween Day approached, the protagonist's unease grew. They knew that they had to do something, but they didn't know what. They wondered if they were the only ones who felt this way, or if others shared their concerns. On Halloween Day, the protagonist arrived at Hidden Springs and parked their car in the tiny lot. The other judges were waiting at the trailhead, and they joined them. They talked amongst themselves as they began to walk through the path and jotted notes on their clipboards. The flock of birds was as thick as the protagonist had ever seen them. Occasionally, one would dart above their heads aggressively, making them jump or stumble. The other judges reacted similarly, but no one verbalized their obvious concern. As they neared the midway point of the trail, Dr. Sterling's Scarecrow came into view. It was covered with crows, and the blue blouse hung in tatters, revealing the disturbingly accurate burlap torso beneath. Ragged swaths of cloth dangled from the face as the birds pecked madly. As they grew closer, the murder of crows bolted from the Scarecrow's limbs and landed in the trees. They cried out toward the judges but kept their distance. Most of Dr. Sterling's creation was in ruins, mauled and shredded by the hateful creatures. The judges all stood before the Scarecrow, their banter disappearing completely as they looked on. With most of the burlap peeled away, the frame beneath was now visible. A human face sat wrapped in frayed cloth, and shredded flesh flopped away from the white plastic mannequin head below. Crusted blood covered the underside of the skin. The judges were all shocked by what they saw, and they quickly called the authorities to report the grisly discovery. The discovery of the human remains inside Dr. Sterling's Scarecrow sent shockwaves through the small town. The police and crime scene technicians descended on Hidden Spring Cave Park, and the area was cordoned off as a crime scene. The judges were all questioned by the police, but none of them had any useful information to give them. Dr. Sterling's Scarecrow had been there for nearly a week, and none of them were there when he had put it out. According to the newspapers in the following weeks, the search of Dr. Sterling's house produced an abundance of information, but nothing led to his whereabouts. Most of his clothing and all of his identification were gone, and he had left his dog with a neighbor, saying he had to travel out of town for business. Dr. Sterling's disappearance was a mystery, and the police had no leads to follow. The community was in shock, and rumors began to circulate about what had happened to him. The judges on the panel were all deeply affected by the discovery of the human remains inside Dr. Sterling's Scarecrow. They couldn't believe that someone they had known and respected could be capable of such a heinous crime. The protagonists couldn't help but wonder if they could have done more to prevent this tragedy. They knew that they had voiced their concerns about the Scarecrow and the birds, but they wondered if they should have done more to raise the alarm. As they went about their daily life, the protagonists found it hard to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over them. They couldn't help but feel like they were being watched and wondered if Dr. Sterling's killer was still out there. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, but there were no new developments in the case. Dr. Sterling's disappearance remained a mystery, and the community began to move on. But the protagonists couldn't forget what had happened. They couldn't forget the sight of Dr. Sterling's Scarecrow covered in blackbirds or the smell of death that hung in the air. They knew that they would never be able to look at Halloween festivals or scarecrows the same way again. This content may violate our content policy. If you believe this to be an error, please submit your feedback. Your input will aid our research in this area. Years passed, and the memory of Dr. Sterling's disappearance began to fade. The protagonists had moved on with their life, but could never forget the unsettling events that had taken place in Hidden Spring Cave Park. One day, they received a call from a detective who had been working on Dr. Sterling's case. The detective told them that they had finally made a breakthrough in the case and had identified a suspect in Dr. Sterling's disappearance. The suspect was a man who had been living in a neighboring town at the time of the crime. He had a history of violence and had recently been released from prison for a similar crime. The detective asked the protagonist to come down to the station to identify the suspect in a lineup. They agreed, and when they arrived at the station, they were shown a lineup of men. The protagonist immediately recognized the suspect and pointed him out to the detective. The suspect was arrested and charged with Dr. Sterling's murder. The trial was a long and arduous process, but finally, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. The suspect was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the protagonist, the verdict brought a sense of closure to the events that had taken place years before. They knew that justice had been served and that Dr. Sterling's killer was finally behind bars. They could finally put the memories of the disturbing Scarecrow and the blackbirds to rest and move on with their life, knowing that they had done everything they could to help solve the case. As they left the courthouse, the protagonist couldn't help but think about the lesson that they had learned from the events that had taken place. They knew that they would always be more vigilant and more aware of their surroundings, and that they would always trust their instincts when it came to their safety. The protagonist hoped that their experience would serve as a warning to others to always be aware of their surroundings and to never let their guard down. They knew that they would never forget the events that had taken place in Hidden Spring Cave Park, but they hoped that their experience could help prevent similar tragedies from happening in the future.